Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Interpreter Hub podcast. As always, I am Mark Rockford, and I am excited today to have someone with us who we'll introduce in just a second that has more experience in the industry than I do, right? Which, she's still young. Like, I don't ever want to say make it seem like, I'm calling somebody old, because that is not the case. I'm a big believer that we are all young for, goodness, 50s, 60s, 70s. To me, that is still young these days, right? If you've ever seen Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone, they are in
Truth.
amazing shape, right? It's a
Hmm.
shape that half of us or all of us probably wish we could be in. And on that note, Mateos,
Hello everyone, Mateo's here. One more week, one more episode. We have another special guest here today, and we have a lot to talk. And again, I am the less experienced in the room, but I think that the energy at least is great. I'm here to cooperate, and I hope I asked the right questions today.
that is awesome. So our guest today, I will let her do most of her own introduction, but is Corinne McKay. She has written several books about how to succeed as a freelance translator, several editions, and now she is releasing one for freelance interpreters, which is amazing because anything that helps you succeed in your chosen profession is great. And being a good interpreter or being a good translator by itself is not enough to make your finances and make your business run, right? So, Corinne?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So, as you said, Mark, I've been a freelancer since 2002. I live in Boulder, Colorado, which is a beautiful small city in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in the western United States. And I started out as a French to English translator in 2002. And for about the first 15 years that I freelanced, I was exclusively a written translator. And I think, part of what we're going to talk about today is the transition to remote interpreting. And the real issue at that time was that remote interpreting was not much of a thing. There was over the phone interpreting, but that was about it. And I have a daughter who's the same age as my freelance business. And I mean, really, I was always interested in interpreting, but it was a question of logistics that I couldn't figure out. The primary reason I wanted to be a freelancer was to be around more when my daughter was little, and I could not figure out how to make interpreting work with that. So in the mid 20 teens, when in remote interpreting still wasn't much of a thing, but I didn't have a small child anymore. In the mid 20 teens, I had this sort of now or never moment with interpreting. And I thought, no one's forcing me to do this, but if I ever want to do it, it's now. So I'm 53 now. So I was like mid late 40s at the time. And so I studied for a year and a half for the state of Colorado court interpreting exam and passed that on the first try in 2019. And then during the school year at the height of the pandemic, I did a master's in French conference interpreting from Glendon College in Toronto, Canada, which is the bilingual campus of York University. And since then, the volume of interpreting work that I've gotten has actually exceeded any of the goals that that I set at the outset. My sort of dream goal was to be half translation and half interpreting by 2 years out from the Glendon program. And in reality, I'm now about 75% interpreting and 25% translation. Although weirdly enough, translation has really been booming lately. I mean, interpreting's going well. Interpreting's the same as it's always been. But weirdly enough, in the first quarter of this year, I had a ton of translation work from good direct clients. But just for reference, last year, I interpreted about 180 days, about equally split between court and conference. So about 90 court and about 90 conference.
That
So
is
yeah,
awesome. Are
that's
you
me.
doing that all remote, or how much of that is actually, since you're working for the courts, I imagine some portion of it is
Hmm.
going to be on site, right? But the conference, I mean, you can work from anywhere.
That's exactly right. So, court, I interpret mostly for the Colorado state courts, but also for some surrounding states. So, if you're familiar with the geography of the US, I also interpret remotely quite a bit for Utah, which is the state to the west of Colorado towards California from Colorado. And yeah, exactly like you said, Mark. For the Colorado courts, I'd say we're about 80% remote. We do go in person for sort of, I hate to say important court cases because everything's important when it's you, but we go in person for things like trials, motions hearings, plea agreements. But if it's just sort of a simple like status update, we do that all remotely. And then my conference interpreting work, I actually think last year, if I think about it in 2024, did I do any in-person conference work? Maybe not. The year before, I did a couple of travel assignments that were a full week at a time, and I have some potential in-person conference assignments, but I think going to a Canadian interpreting school really opened the door to remote interpreting work for Canada, of which there is a huge amount for French, because basically for anything even remotely tied to the federal government, they're required to interpret everything pretty much. So yeah, so my conference interpreting work is pretty much fully remote. And I mean, to your point about you can do it from anywhere, I mean, yes and no. I think one of the things that I've learned is like, it's really easy because my kid, who's the same age as my freelance business, she's now 22 and in college/university on the other side of the US. She's our only child. So my husband and I are empty nesters now. And I think one of the things I've found is it's like really, really easy to digital nomad when you're doing translation, but less easy for interpreting because, for example, I will only do remote interpreting over a wired internet connection, not over Wi-Fi. I think it's too undependable. So it has to be someplace that I know I can plug into the modem, and then it has to be someplace quiet. It actually is, in my opinion, significantly harder to interpret, quote unquote, from anywhere. It's not impossible, but you have to think about it a lot more than like, well, there's a potentially spotty internet connection, but all I have to do is email these files to someone. It's a lot different than that.
That's great advice. I don't think that applies just to conference interpreting. However,
Right.
Coming from the quality world, for any interpretation, we always recommended a wired connection because you just never. Wi-Fi is great. There's a lot of really, really good signal out there, but there's also a lot of really splotchiness, and every cable company will always give you the cheapest router they can possibly manage.
Right.
So if you take the time to set up mesh or some other like incredibly robust network, then that might be a different story. But I mean, that is awesome. So have you always spoken French? Is that your where did that come from?
No. So no. I mean, it's sort of, I always have to answer that question the way someone in the US would interpret it versus people anywhere else in the world. So I did not grow up bilingual. I started taking French in school in American 7th grade. So I guess I was 12 maybe. And it was my favorite subject in middle school and high school. And then I did a bachelor's degree in French and did study abroad in France for a year. Then I did a master's in French literature, and then I married a half Swiss guy. So I now have dual Swiss American citizenship, and we go there quite a bit. So like the thing is, the reason why I was joking at the start of that answer, like for an American, that's a pretty robust language background. But for example, when I went to Glendon, I would tell people that whole year, because it's true, I was the only what I would call a real French B in that group. Like, I did not grow up bilingual. I did not go to bilingual school. I don't use French in my day-to-day life. No one else in my family speaks French. So I guess for someone who's not from the US, like that language background, I mean, it's just sort of a weird situation. Like that language background seems less robust for an interpreter than it does to someone in the US. So yeah, I mean, so in one sense, right, I've been speaking French, since I was 12. But on the other hand, when I went to Glendon, I would tell people like the other people in this program who call themselves English A, French B, like grew up in Montreal and spoke English at home and went to French school, which I did not do anything even close to that. So, yeah.
That is awesome. And just because I'm curious, this has really nothing to do with anything, but the court cases you're seeing, right? Obviously, you can't speak about the
Mm-hmm.
court cases themselves, but the French speakers,
Mm-hmm.
what's the variety of French speakers that you're dealing with in
Mm.
in Colorado? Like, I don't know in
Mm-hmm.
Utah, I don't know what populations are
Yeah.
there. I can't imagine it's all Canadian. I imagine there's a bunch
Oh,
of different
no, no, no.
African and
Almost
yeah.
exclusively West African. So, Colorado and the surrounding states have actually a huge number of West African immigrants who come here largely to work in the agriculture and livestock industries and, maybe stay for other reasons or maybe continue working in those industries. But I think, typically in Colorado, even without a lot of English skills, you can actually make pretty good money working in the agriculture and livestock industries because, to be honest, they're industries that, not to turn it into a political discussion, that are pretty much dominated by immigrant labor. Jobs that quote unquote native born Americans are not super enthusiastic about doing, working in a slaughterhouse, for example. Like in Greeley, which is the sort of largest city in northern Colorado, and I interpret in the courts there, the majority of the people who I work for work in feedlots and slaughterhouses, which are jobs where you're going to see almost exclusively immigrants to the US working in those kinds of positions. So, yeah, almost exclusively West African. Once in a great while, I'll interpret for a European French speaker, but it's usually because of some unusual circumstance. You know what I mean? Like they were here, they were in the US on vacation and they got into a serious car accident. I had a situation like that a while ago. Somebody who got into a car accident where they were determined to be at fault and the other person was injured. So they had to come back, for another court hearing. But that's pretty atypical. Not many Europeans and honestly, not many Haitians either. Like I lived in Boston for a long time before I moved to Colorado, and there's a pretty large Haitian immigrant population in Boston, but here almost no one. So more like Burkina Faso, Guinea, Senegal, Mauritania, places like that.
That's awesome. That's the one thing I
Yeah,
love
it's
about
cool.
interpreting. You
It's
never
cool.
know what you're going to learn, right? Like you think
Yep.
legal and you don't automatically think you're going to learn slaughterhouse terminology. But I bet
Right.
that's probably old hat to you at this point, right?
Right. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say old hat, but you're right. Like I think one of the things that's really interesting about quote unquote legal translation or interpreting is that it's not about the law. It's about, you have someone who's worked in a slaughterhouse for 10 years and is filing a workers' compensation claim because they say that they have, persistent nerve pain in their arms. And the question is really like, is this a pre-existing condition? Is this the employer's fault for unsafe working conditions? Like, so you're right. I mean, I think, it's the cross section of humanity that you see if you just go hang out in court is pretty interesting. So
Pretty
yeah.
wild, yeah.
Hmm.
Well, I'm going to use that kind of a segue. Pretty wild. Also, we didn't really touch on this too much. We mentioned it briefly, but what inspired you to be an author? Like, why did you decide to write for other freelancers?
Well, so I mean, the thing that's kind of crazy looking back on it is I started freelancing in late 2002. So my daughter was born in September of 2002. I started freelancing pretty much as soon as she was born, but really, let's say more like early 2003. And I wrote the first edition of How to Succeed as a Freelance Translator in 2006. And now when I think back on it, I'm like, good Lord, what did I know? About me. I was still a baby freelancer myself. But the reality is, which is, probably sort of weird to your listeners who are in their 20s and early 30s, like freelancing was much less of an established thing at that time. And so I really like beat my head against the wall of trying to find out how to run a business. Like I remember the first translation job that I ever did, and they said, send us your invoice. I called my husband at work and said, like, what do you think that means? to, I mean, I laugh about it now, but how would you know? You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
because I think also
basics.
like I had never run a business before. And I think, something for your listeners to think about is like, whether you do or don't kind of come from an entrepreneurial family, which I don't. My parents are both scientists and they both had, traditional salary jobs their whole careers. And so sometimes when I talk to other freelancers, like I talked to someone the other day who said, "Oh, my parents are both piano teachers and they ran a music school out of our house my whole life growing up." So like that person kind of always knew that it was possible to like make a go of it economically without having a quote unquote real job, which like in my family, everybody had real jobs. You know what I mean? I didn't know any, I don't come from an entrepreneurial background at all. And so I think it was more that I thought like, well, you know, if I really struggled with the business aspects of running a freelance business, maybe other people do too. And so it was more that I thought, like if I had these, surely I'm not the only one with these struggles, which it turned out that I wasn't. And even my husband, who was like my biggest cheerleader, said at the start, like, "Do you think there's enough people that would buy that it would be worth writing it?" And it's now sold more than 15,000 copies in 3 editions. So it turns out that, by a long shot, I was not the only one with those questions. So really, it was just sort of born out of like all of the things that I struggled with my first few years in business, because I think, for most of us, the language side is the easy part. It's finding clients, deciding how much to charge so that you have enough work, but you can pay your bills, deciding what to specialize in. All of those things are for, I think, most of us, like that's what keeps us up at night, not the language part.
When I heard a
Yeah.
story about freelancers in the United States that when you're applying for mortgage or when it's time to buy a property, some states, if you're a freelancer, they don't accept that as proof of employment or income evidence. Is that true?
I mean, I wouldn't say they don't accept it. I would say you have to show more of a track record of employment, of a successful employment as a freelancer than you do as someone with a salary job. Like if you have a salary job, I mean, whether or not, like we haven't bought a house in so long that we've lived in the same house for, almost 20 years. So I don't really know now, but whether, because I think, one thing that I often tell people is like those of us who aren't 22 years old kind of grew up with this mindset that a stable job is a job for an employer and that it's like super risky to be a freelancer. Whereas now I think in a way, I don't want to say the opposite is true, but that's less true now. Whereas I think, you know, um, say people who are losing their jobs because of the federal government cuts in the US right now, some of them literally it's one day to the next. A job that you maybe had for 20 years is completely gone. Whereas one thing that I sort of think is like those of us who are freelancers could even train ourselves to do something completely different as a freelancer. Like if we had a sense that our freelance work was diminishing, that we could sort of say like, well, what's on the up and up now? I don't know, maybe being like I don't know, UX consultant. I'm just pulling that out of the air. But we could say, you know what, I'm going to train on the side to become like a multilingual SEO consultant, let's say. And we could even start doing something completely different. Whereas when you work for an employer, it's like really, really all your eggs are in that basket. So, I mean, if we wanted to buy a house now, would they look at my, 22 years of freelance income and be like, I don't know, looks pretty risky? I'm not sure, but it certainly is true that if you say, well, I've been freelancing for 6 months, that's not going to look great to like a financial institution in the US. You're right about that.
Okay. I want to kind of dive back into the basics, and you probably have some pretty good tips from the books, right? But like, so when you first got started, no idea what invoices are. Probably there's a lot of other things you're like, what is that? Or what do I do here? Because, I mean, if you've ever diagrammed a business, awesome. If you haven't, I'd highly recommend you do, because as a freelancer, you're the business owner, you're the accountant, you're the marketer, you're the salesperson, you're the operations person, you're the technology, the IT guy, you're the typist, you're the secretary, you're the chauffeur,
You
you're
got it.
everything,
Office
right?
cleaner,
Yeah, everything. And
Yep.
and like we don't realize that like, when we're going into this a lot of the time. We're like, I'm just gonna be an interpreter, right? That's it. So what are some of those things at the beginning that you really feel you should know, or like you really should work on? And what are the tips you've got for those things?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that too few beginning freelancers do is, well, let's say, I'll say too many people stay stuck in survival mode. So you start out and your biggest fear is you're going to have no clients, right? Like my first year as a freelancer, I made 9,000 US dollars. And to be honest, I was ecstatic because my biggest fear was that I would make $0,000. But I think that the real problem is too many people sort of stay stuck at a what I would call like a survival level of income. And I think, one thing that maybe is a little different about how I talk about freelancing than some people is I actually love talking about money. Like, not only do I think it's not weird to talk about money, I love talking about money. And so I think a really crucial thing for any of your more beginner listener, or really anybody, any of your listeners to do, is the whole idea of looking at your income with the end goal in mind. So the first person I ever heard talk about this is a freelance translator who is now semi-retired named Jonathan Hine. And the first American Translators Association conference I ever went to was in 2004. And I went to a presentation by Jonathan Hine, and he wrote a little booklet that's still in print that is called I Am Worth It, which is about how to set your rates as a translator or interpreter. And I think the thing that teaches you is, when someone comes to me and says, here's a rate that a client offered me, do you think it's a quote unquote good rate? That I say, I have no idea because I don't know what your financial needs or goals are. Like my financial needs / goals are pretty high because although I'm a frugal person, we live in a pretty expensive area of the US. And moreover, I hate worrying about money. I don't want to be thinking when we get that surprise, multi-thousand-dollar bill for something, how are we going to pay that? I hate that feeling. So I think one thing that is really important for everyone to do is to take all of your business expenses and all of your personal expenses, let's say for 1 month, add it all up. And the thing is, that's going to be a big number. That I think what many, many freelancers are really afraid to face down that big number because they think that they're going to look at it and say, I could never make that. But to me, first of all, there are clients at every price point. I think with interpreting, we have more the phenomenon of that more than translators do. We have the phenomenon of markets where we are what you might call price takers instead of price makers. Like if you want to know what I make as a court interpreter in Colorado, I may as well just tell you because you can look it up. You know what I mean? Like everyone in Colorado who's certified for a language other than Spanish makes $65 an hour with a 2-hour minimum, half rate for travel time, and whatever the current mileage rate is. So in that market, I'm a price taker, not a price maker. I can't control how much they pay me. I can only decide how much of their work I'm willing to take at the rates that they do pay. But I think most freelancers who I talk to, when I say, like, how many hours do you need to be billing, not working, billing, right? Because as freelancers, we do a lot of work that nobody pays us to do. All the things you mentioned, Mark. All the other director of hats that we wear, director of IT, director of marketing, director of professional development, all those things no one pays us to do. But most freelancers, when I say, how many hours a week would you need to bill at what rate to reach your target income? They're literally like, I have no idea. Because how would you know that if you never thought about it? And to me, like I can more be thinking, I need to be billing $95 to $110 an hour, 25 to 30 hours a week in order to reach my target income. Now for you, maybe for, some of your listeners, maybe that's way, way less. Like, I'm not saying that you have to, aspire to a 6-figure income if you don't need it or want it. I actually kind of look forward to the day in maybe 15, 20 years when I can kind of work on whatever I feel like and just use the money for nice vacations. But I think that whole idea of starting with the end financial goal in mind, rather than here's what most people are doing, here's what I did before I really thought about it. You work for what clients, stop me if this sounds familiar. You work for what clients seem willing to pay, and you pray that that adds up to enough money to pay your bills. And if it doesn't, you just work more. I mean, and I'm not making fun of people by saying that. I'm saying that's what probably, in my experience, 80% of freelancers are doing, is they work for what it looks like clients are willing to pay. They hope that it's enough money. And if it's not enough money, the only tool that they have in the toolbox is to work more hours.
Yeah, I would actually say that applies to employees too, honestly.
Yep.
There's so many
Yep.
people.
You're right.
I think that's just people in general that they work on the how I'm going to get there instead of where I'm going, right? And so they end up in the wrong destination. They end up with the wrong number, and they realize, oh, crap, I've actually got to work a second job, or I've got to work 15 more hours, or I've got to take on another, 17 documents to translate, or whatever the case may be. So, yeah, I think that is some great advice. Know your number, right, is what I want to call it. So that you can say, I've got to make, I'm just going to say $2,000 a month, whatever that happens to be. That's going to, as you said, vary by person, which I think is important because Matthias and I have responded to quite a few LinkedIn posts about this where some interpreters in particular are trying to shame companies and other interpreters for lower rates. And they're not great, don't get me wrong, but as you said, their price point is their price point. Right. So if an interpreter, if they want to take, I'm just going to say $5 an hour, I'm just going to, throw numbers out there that may or may not be real. Right. And that works for them, gets them their price point. Like, as you said, I think that's more of a survival rate that we hope they don't stay at forever. But if it gets their foot in the door and gets their needs met, right, there's, in my opinion, no shame in that. Right. Do I advocate for them to stay there for 20 years? I think that's a hell no. Right. But,
right.
But it's more difficult for international interpreters to negotiate their rates than it is for US-based interpreters because we don't have that many options, and they always find someone to hire and pay less outside the United States.
I mean, the thing I have such mixed feelings about with that is that I feel like when I first started out as a translator, even the really big translation companies, I won't say names, but we can all, envision, even the really big translation companies paid what I would consider like decent money for French to English translation, like even, 12 cents a word sort of rates for French to English. And now I'd say that you've seen rates in the agency rates in the translation world fall by half at least, and maybe more. And in a sense, I think, in the let's say in the conference interpreting world, why has that not happened? And I think the reality is because interpreters resist. Because if the agency can't find anyone to work at the rates they're offering, they really have no choice except to pay more or go out of business. So in one sense, I think we all need to get out of this mindset that like working is better than not working, because it isn't always. Because not only are you contributing to the devaluing of everybody else's work, but you put yourself in a situation where you go, okay, now I have to interpret 40 hours a week to pay my bills. So then on top of it, I have to do my accounting. I have to try to do marketing. I have to try to do professional development. And the reality is that you just don't do most of that stuff, that then you become that person that when I, like when I do business consultations with freelancers who feel like they're not making enough money, one of the things that you start out by saying to them is, well, what kinds of agencies or direct clients have you applied to in, let's say, the last 6 months? And what kind of response did you get? And you guys can probably guess the typical answer I get is none, zero. Like I respond if clients contact me, but as far as outbound marketing, I don't do anything. And so I think that's the tough thing is like, not only then do rates drop for everybody, but worse yet, you put yourself in a situation where all you have is low paying work and you have no time or energy to market for better stuff.
Yeah, that's true. But how do you prevent, like, there's no way to prevent that competition, right? So let's just
No,
take a step
no.
back because unfortunately, and what I have a lot of trouble getting people to understand is there's really only one barrier to entry to interpreting, and that's that you've got to be bilingual, right? And not even fluently bilingual, right?
Right.
Because you see, and I'm not just going to say outside the United States, I've seen this with on-site interpreters, I've seen this with remote interpreters, both
Oh,
domestic
yeah.
and international, where you can call it warm body syndrome, as our guest last week did, or whatever you want, but people will find anybody that is able to speak both languages, right, and throw them into these situations and pay a pittance, right,
Yep.
and especially abroad where there are these, I don't know what I would like to call them, but like we'll call them companies that set up these call centers in country, and they will literally take English teachers or whatever, whoever they happen to be, that can pass their fluency test. That's it, and throw them on the phone. And again, I won't mention agency
Right.
names either, but I've heard of like big companies. They start them off on 911 calls, right? They just throw them
God,
right
that's
in.
right. No, you're totally right. And I mean, it happens in the US too. Like, to be honest, one of the reasons that I decided to do a conference interpreting master's is because before I went to school for interpreting, I would get contacts from, say local interpreting agencies that would say, well, we have a, in-person conference in Aspen, Colorado. This was before COVID. And I would be like, oh gosh, no, there's no way I'm qualified to do that. Definitely not. And then I would ask them later, like just out of curiosity, who did you end up finding? And they would say, something exactly like what you said, Mark. And this is in high paying markets in the US, like, oh, the local middle school French teacher was able to get take a personal day from work. And, I mean, and one thing that the one thing that
And
I
what did she
think,
say? Je ne
right,
parle pas français, right?
right, exactly. How was her
I don't speak
simul?
French yet.
Right. Yeah. How was her simul? But I do think that, this is a bit tangential, but I think it's interesting for people who do both translation and interpreting that I think the one advantage that you have is bad translation is surprisingly invisible to most people, whereas bad interpreting is something that attracts people's attention. Like I've had clients who they don't even know, right? They don't even know much about interpreting, but they'll say, like, well, we had this interpreter last time, and it seemed like the person she was interpreting for had a hard time understanding her, like kept having to ask her to repeat herself, or they'll even say, like, the interpreter just looked terrified. We started talking and it was obvious that the interpreter
Sweaty.
had no clue what she was supposed to be doing, and was doing, like, the thing we've all heard people do who can't really do simul: listen, pause, summarize, listen, pause, summarize. So that's like the one advantage, is that I do feel like substandard interpreting is something that is a lot easier for like the general public to assess than when you look at a translation and go like, oh my gosh, this is so clearly like deep L and no one even read it. And someone who's not a translator will be like, really? How did you know that?
That's funny. I'm going to say a yes and here because what I really want to go where what you're saying is differentiation, right? Like you were
Yeah,
talking
right,
about your master's in conference interpreting, which you don't have to have a master's in conference interpreting to be a good conference interpreter, right? But
right.
that degree, those I'm going to say 2 or 3 lines on your resume really stand out. They make a huge
Yep.
difference because then that is a barrier to entry. That is you investing in your business, investing in yourself to say, Corinne is different than every other interpreter out there. And she's not your local high school French teacher, right?
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah, no, I think it's true that I think, one of the pieces of advice that I often give beginning interpreters is like, if it's in your budget and your available time, try to get some sort of certification, because exactly like you said, Mark, it's really all about like setting yourself apart from the, well, like I spoke Spanish with my grandparents when I was growing up. And like, I hate to pick on Spanish, but in the US, I really think that that is the language that has the sort of like anyone can do it mindset, that there's a lot of people who are heritage speakers or just like semi-heritage speakers. Who then think like, oh, maybe I'll go be an interpreter. And I think it's like, it's always just like it's hard for us as freelancers to decide like when is it better to work than not work. I do think that it is really tough, especially for institutions that have tight budgets, hospitals, school systems, things like that, to think like, when is it better to have someone who at least speaks both languages rather than someone who is a trained professional and moreover knows the ethics of the profession, that like, you're not the one giving advice in the parent teacher conference. You're not, that it's acceptable to say to the teacher, like, my impression is that the parents maybe don't understand this concept. Would it be possible for the teacher to explain it in a different way? But that you don't say, oh, I'll explain to you what an IEP is. I think it's like, it's a hard call all around, because at least in the US, and I'm sure, in every country, there is a huge demand for language interpreters, like really greater than the supply of trained professional interpreters that institutions like schools and hospitals have the budget to pay for. Court's a different story, because in the US it's very regulated. The court interpreting market is pretty regulated in most states, so you don't really have that phenomenon that like they have to find a qualified person even if it's expensive. But a lot of times in other markets that's less true.
And what do you think about the future of AI now? Do you feel that interpreting is being threatened by AI like translation once was, or do you think it's different?
Sorry for laughing. No, I do think it's different. So I've given a couple of conference keynotes this year where this is, I mean, of course, like the hot topic that everybody wants to talk about. And here's what I would say. Interpreting is a lot harder to automate, but the incentives to automate it are a lot greater. Like, for example, here in the US, and I would think in other countries as well, we have people whose entire job is interpreter scheduling, right? All they do is sit at the computer or on the phone all day and be like, we need a Tagalog interpreter in Houston, Thursday at 10 a.m. Who am I going to find? And so when you think about, and I think interpreting is in general more expensive and logistically more complicated than translation. So when you think about, what would it do for the court system in the US if we could be like, here, put on this magic headset and you can listen to the judge in Japanese. But when you think about, think about what it's like to dictate a text into your phone. Right? And particularly if you have anything non-standard about the way you talk. If you have an accent, if you have a, speech impediment, anything like that, then think about it using that plus machine translation plus speech output. Like, the thing that I feel right now, and who knows, I may be proven wrong, is that I think that true machine interpreting for unscripted live events, like, put on the magic headset and listen to this conference presentation in Spanish, I think that is beyond the working lifetimes of any of us who are working interpreters today. I think that day may come, but I don't think that day will come in our working lifetimes. But I do think that what we're already seeing, because I already lost a client this way, so we are certainly seeing it, is clients working around. So for example, I used to do, and I want to say it so you get the point, but I don't say anything confidential. I used to do the English voiceovers for a Canadian entity that did medical patient education videos, right? So the original video, it was interview videos. The original videos would be in French, and then I would record the English voiceover track. And this client said, you know what I think we're going to go to is automated captions in English. So they're just going to feed it into, like, I use a tool called Happy Scribe when I want to, like, I do a lot of captioned videos for my online courses. I don't do translated ones, but the automated captioning it's okay, but they're planning on doing this, to my knowledge, with no proofreading because they don't have any native English speakers on their staff. So the thing is that I think it is not inconceivable to me that for events or things where the client is doing the interpreting not because they want to but because they have to, that they could say, we're not going to have live interpreting, we're going to give you a translated transcript after. Like, the real thing will be only in English, and if you want it in Spanish, the next day we'll give you a translated transcript and you can just read that. So I don't think that we really need to be like, most of the clients that I work for are doing interpreting because they actually care or because there's a legal requirement that the interpreting be accurate. Like in court in Colorado, we can't even take notes on an iPad. So there's no way. We're prohibited from, you can only take notes on paper. So the chance is zero. Like literally zero that they would trust technology to do the interpreting. And I think for conference clients that really care, there's no way that they're going to trust machine interpreting. But I do think that we're going to see some incursion of not really machine interpreting, but of saying, we're going to try automated captioning, or we're going to try, for our online course, instead of having live interpreters like we always have, we're going to give people transcripts translated into Spanish after the fact. So I don't know. That's my take.
That's interesting. Do you see any parallels in technology between what's happened in translation of the written word and what's happened in interpretation?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm a little bit less freaked out by AI than some people are, because my feeling tends to be like, the world changes. That, that's life. Like, my grandmother, who has since passed away, but, lived to be into her 80s, grew up on a farm in Texas where she and her siblings rode a mule to a one-room schoolhouse and went from that to seeing people walking on the moon, And I just think, like, particularly for those of us who lived through the internet transition. So, like, I graduated from undergrad in 1993, and like, I knew people who had email, but I didn't have email yet. Like, the internet was kind of on the horizon. And do you remember when Wikipedia was like the hot new thing? And people would be like, oh, if you saw it on Wikipedia, I don't know. And I feel like now that's how people feel about ChatGPT, that I just think, it really is just the next wave of the transition that we all went through with the internet. And that, like, when I think of my 22-year-old daughter, she and her same age friends don't really have emotions about AI. It's something that is useful or not. It's useful for some things and it's not for other things. Like, I just saw the other day, you guys probably know Renato Beninato. You should see if he'll be on here. Yeah. So you should have him as a guest. So I saw that and I thought, like, yes, this is so true that Renato said I'm sure you can find the post on LinkedIn, that he was translating some PowerPoint slides and thought, like, oh, look, now there's this automated translation plugin. And so he auto translated it just to see what it did. And in the end, he was like, I ended up just translating it by hand because because I knew what I wanted to say and the automated translation wasn't really getting it. And in the end, I felt like it was faster and came out better to translate it myself. So for me, I think, when you're interpreting for a conference and you get the keynote speech 3 minutes before the keynote address is going to be given and the person is going to read it, you literally have no choice except to pre-translate that thing and compare the, draft pre-translation to what the person is actually saying. Like, there is no way that you can keep up unless you have something to refer to, which at that point is going to be a machine translation. But at the same time, I would say the same thing, that I don't use I don't like starting from a machine translation draft, but sometimes when I'll try machine translating something and see what it gives me, sometimes it's useful and sometimes it's not. And that sounds like a really, vague thing to say, but I just think that, the same is true. And to me, to try to oppose technology for the sake of opposing technology is, I'm not going to say it's wrong, because standing up for what you believe in is what life is all about, but I think it's pointless.
It's not wrong, but it's just not effective. It's not
right.
It's gonna
Yes,
work,
that's right. That's a way better way of saying it. Right. It's not wrong, but I don't think it's effective. That I think for people, like now when I give conference presentations, I always say, like, here are some of the things that I find AI really helpful for. If you hate AI, don't use it. It's okay. like, like it's okay, but I'm just going to give you some use cases that for me, I think are really helpful. So I feel, less intimidated by AI, and that I think, like, I'm not 100 years old, but I'm over 50. Like, I'm, more than halfway to the finish line, if you want to put it that way. I've, statistically, I mean, but I do think it is a different outlook on life when you have more years behind you than ahead of you. And unless I live to be older than 106, that's true for me. And I think every generation has the feeling of being part of a world that is moving on without you. Like, I just think that's my sort of philosophical take, is that part of being in the second half of life is feeling like the world is moving on quickly and in some ways without me. And I would bet you that every generation, like my grandmother went to her grave lamenting how, people don't write paper letters anymore. Like, how are you even communicating over that computer? Like, she grew up in a house where when they wanted to tell the neighbors something, they hung a quilt out the window to tell the neighbors to come over because they had something important to tell them. And so I just think that, to me, like, that's not specific to our profession. It's specific to life in general, that I think that feeling of this is all going too fast and I don't get it just means you're not 22. That.
Yeah. Well, I think we're all hanging quilts out the window. There are important things that we've got to tell people, right?
Totally.
Life is changing. And
right.
Unfortunately, I think people in general, we don't like change. We don't like uncertainty,
yes.
right? So, like,
yes.
I'm going to pull something out what you said, and it's their comfort level. If you don't like AI, use it, and stop complaining about it. Use it, try it out, get comfortable with it, find out what it's good for and what it's not good for. Although that changes all the time, right? But if you use it, you're going to feel more certain. You're going to feel more safe. You're going to feel like, oh yeah, this really probably won't be replacing me, at least in the next 5 years or whatnot, right?
Right.
Or maybe it will actually lead to more of my services, because this could be quicker, faster for those introductory
right.
scheduling calls that suddenly turn into the patient saying, I have a question, and then, oh, well, I need a live interpreter for these questions, right? And so it'll take you there, right? You just don't know. Since a lot of our audience is outside the U.S., like, let's focus in on maybe some useful tips that you would, suggest to them about maybe standing out, because they're not going to be able to show up at the Colorado courts, unfortunately, right? They may be using an iPad from the safety of their home. We don't know.
right.
What can they do to stand out? What can they do to
yeah, Mateo says his iPad.
to make them different?
Don't take notes on that thing. You never know what it might be recording.
The other 100 people that are, competing for their spot, or, that want that gig, or that might be, a cent lower a minute, or whatever the case may be.
Yep. So yeah, really, really good question. And I think the first thing that I would say is, like, always be learning and growing and developing yourself at whatever budget level is realistic for you. So I think if you look at, some of the, I would say, positive changes since COVID, the access to online learning is just tremendous. If we look at outlets like Coursera, like Udemy, HubSpot Academy, like I recently took the HubSpot Academy SEO course. It was free. I thought it was really good. And so
YouTube.
I think, yeah, right, exactly. So I think even stuff like that really helps to differentiate you from the average, just sort of untrained bilingual person in your country. Then you want to think about some sort of certification, because I think as freelancers, we always look at stuff as an expense rather than an investment. And so, for example, I mean, I'm just going to pull this out of the air, but I don't know. I'm not positive that in every state in the US that you have to be a resident of that state to take the court interpreter exam. So I'm just pulling this out of the air. But maybe it would be worth it to you to make a trip to the US and try to become certified for court interpreting in a US state, or try to take a US based, medical interpreter certification, because I think we always look at it as like, oh, that's crazy expensive. Well, but what if that gives you access to, a whole new market? I mean, I think like there are people who are pretty prominent in the American Translators Association as translators, interpreters, trainers who don't live in the US, and it's because they've really like established themselves as the go-to person for a specific service. And so I think really differentiating yourself through continuing education and certifications, and always balancing, like I heard, you guys probably know Ed Gandia, who's a, American marketing guru, email marketing guru. And he used an expression the other day that I loved. KTLO, keep the lights on clients. That we all have our clients who you go, what, you know what, they keep the lights on. Like I work for those clients because they keep my lights on. And I think always thinking to yourself, like, I think we also sort of fall into the like all or nothing mindset. Like, okay, now I'm going to quit working for these lousy low end clients and work for better clients. Well, maybe have a goal of over 3 months filtering in one better paying client, to say to yourself, like between now and summer vacation in the Northern Hemisphere would be, so we're recording this on March 31st, and a lot of people take time off in July and August. And so you tell yourself, like, okay, by the end of June, I want to try to do enough marketing that I can find one better paying client, to a client who really appreciates what I have to offer. Like, perhaps that this is a client, maybe I'm in Argentina, let's say, and perhaps this is a client who, for their own business, really appreciates the fact that I'm there, that I know the Argentinian culture and slang and things like that. And I'm not going to just work for clients who are like, oh, she's any old Spanish speaker, who are going to say, like, we really want an experienced, Argentinian Spanish interpreter for this job, and do that one at a time. Don't pressure yourself to be like, okay, I'm going to ditch all of my low paying clients and work for a whole new market. It usually doesn't happen that way.
That's really good advice. I would also say, like, I like, I'm going to call them proactive metrics as opposed to reactive metrics, right? So if you're going to get one new client over 3 months, how many clients do you have to reach out to? Do you have to look
Right.
for to get? Because you will get 0% of the clients that you don't reach out to, right?
Yes.
So you have to say, to get one client, I have to send out 5 applications. And then you
Oh, more like
have to build a
100.
relationship,
Yeah,
whatever the case
more
may
like
be, right?
100. Yeah,
Whatever the case may
right.
be, right? For, because and that will vary between translation and interpretation, right? And it depends on your language
Totally.
pairs and so much. But you have to reach out, and then you have to build a relationship, which is a hard part, and maintain that relationship. Because if they're one of your keep the light on clients, right? If they like you, they will try to keep you. If
Yes.
they don't know you very well, aka they feel apathetic or they have no strong bond, they will kick you out as soon as somebody better and or cheaper comes along, right?
Yep.
But if you're cemented in because, like, oh man, I worked with her for years, she's awesome, she sends me sugar cookies at Christmas,
Yeah.
right? I really like her,
Well,
she
and I
answers
think
me the next day.
with interpreting also, I think it's so much more personal than translation. You get that agency's end clients loving you. And they're like, what do you mean Mateus doesn't work for you anymore? Like, what?
Go look for
He
Mateus.
Right. Like, come on. He interpreted our, employee town hall meetings. He interpreted that entire HR training that we did, and everybody loved him. What do you mean we can't have him? So that's the other thing, is that I think like being a nice person who's easy to work with and shows up on time and looks happy to be there and shows appreciation for what the client does. It doesn't make up for it if you're a substandard interpreter, but it goes a long way towards being retained if you're a good interpreter, that all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, like he was so nice and so great and all of our Spanish speaking employees loved him. What do you mean we can't get him?
100%. I have past experience with a Vietnamese interpreter. She was just wonderful. She did happen to be domestic, but she was competing against all the international folks. And she got so many customer compliments. And if you listen to her calls, she's just this sweet lady, right? They're like, oh, you were so good. They seem to really love you and you were great with me. She's like, oh, would you mind telling my bosses that? And would get the compliment, right? Like at the end, just so nicely. She wouldn't solicit it if they didn't say anything, but if they did give her the opportunity. And so every other week there was a compliment coming in on this lady, right? So
oh my God, that's such a great tip. Is when you work for agencies, and whenever you work for an end client that says something nice about you, right? You're exactly right, Mark. Mark, you should be a guest on this podcast. You're exactly right. Like, don't do it in a pushy way, but just say like, hey, would you have 2 seconds to just email your contact at the agency and tell them that, when they're like, oh my gosh, we're so excited that it's you again, right. Or like, the last time that we had this, whatever, like multilingual HR training, everybody was raving about how great you did, that you just ask them, hey, would you mind telling the agency that? Because then sometime the agency will miraculously find the money to keep you or pay you more, because they can't risk losing the end client, that they're like, oh my God, but like if we don't have Mateus on the part 2 of the HR training, they might go to another agency if they feel like it's just going to be any old interpreter because our people just loved him.
Yeah, that is 100% right. Well, we have reached the end of the time, so like I really want to thank you. I don't want to go over and take up too much of your time.
Oh, thank you. It was super fun. Good questions.
Yeah, we would love just to give you a quick plug. When did your book already come out, or when does your book come out?
It's going to come out. The projected publication date is May 1st. It's called Getting Started as a Freelance Interpreter. First of all, because I didn't want it to be confused with How to Succeed as a Freelance Translator. And then also because this time I know what I don't know. When I wrote How to Succeed as a Freelance Translator, isn't that the blessing of being young and early in your career? I didn't know what I didn't know, so I just thought I'll call it How to Succeed.
I know what it's all about.
Right. So it should be out in May, and then my next project is, much to my shock, the 20th anniversary edition of How to Succeed as a Freelance Translator, because the first edition came out in 2006. I did second and third editions about 5 years apart. So now the 20th anniversary edition of that is I'm working on it like right this red hot second.
Congratulations. And can they get those off of your website? Should they go to Amazon if they want to purchase an edition? Can they get it electronically, or is it only in print?
All of the above, wherever fine books are sold, or you can go to my website, trainingfortranslators.com, and click the resources tab, and you can buy electronic versions there.
That is awesome. Well, guys, you heard it here. If you want to grab something in print, and not just if you're like me and you like to read things still, you don't want to just watch videos.
Me too. I still read paper books. Yes, I still read paper books.
Then check it out on Amazon or go to Training for Translators. No dashes or anything, right?
No. Just training for FOR translators.com.
Yeah. Just want to make sure, right? Get them there. So, well, it's been awesome. Thank you so much. And
thank you guys.
We would love to chat again in the future.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.